the first section here, Jesus' resurrection. Is it a ridiculous claim that we just believe the same way kids believe in tooth fairies and things like that? Just something you just take on faith, believe really hard, clench your teeth, you know, knock your heels together and hope that it's true, and that is Christianity. That's how we believe in the resurrection. Is it solely faith, or is it actually something reasonable to believe in? Are there reasons to believe that it might be true? Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 kind of lays this out. If there was no resurrection of Jesus, there is no living Christ, and everything we have preached is smoke and mirrors and empty promises. If Christ was not raised, our hope is in vain, and we are of all men to be most pitied. That's one thing that Christianity has starkly in opposition to all other religions. There is a central claim that if it's true, if it can be falsified, then we all have to pick another team. It is falsifiable. It is possible, with given the right evidence, to say that this is not the case. It's not just we're seeking enlightenment, we're seeking you know, some tablets we found that say a certain thing that we just have to believe is true. It's actually based on a truth claim that is verifiable. Or I should say there's evidence for it. We can test the evidence and decide whether it's persuasive or not, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So certainly we do exercise our faith, but we do so when we find the object of our faith to be reasonable. We don't, you know, stand on a train terminal and just take a step of faith off an open platform. You know, we think ahead, and is there a train there? Is there a plane? Do I think this looks like it's in sound condition? Should I get in this car? We do exercise faith. We practice faith, exercise it, but we do it in things that seem worthy of placing our faith in. So we're looking at, is it a reasonable thing to place our faith in? We don't have mathematical certainty of the resurrection. There's very few things in life we do have mathematical certainty of, but is it reasonable? We're going to take a version of the minimal facts approach. This was popularized by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. And what he does is takes facts agreed upon by the majority of scholars. And by that, I don't just mean bloggers or whatever. I mean people who actually have degrees in history, who actually practice in the field, have a job, are recognized as professionals in the field. So there are 12 facts we're going to go through that historians almost, by the majority, almost unanimously agree to be true. Now, they don't connect the dots and say, yes, we all believe in the resurrection, otherwise it'd be too easy and we wouldn't have anything to talk about here. But if you look at these things we'll go through that are true claims and that are verifiable, what I'm going to argue based on these 12 is the most plausible answer that puts all 12 of these together is that God raised Jesus from the dead. In going through these 12, I want you to be keeping two things in mind. One, I'd like to make sure you understand each point, and they're pretty simple points, I think. But if I don't communicate one well or you have a question, feel free to ask, just to understand as we're building this cumulative case. If you don't understand it or it's confusing or you can't connect the dots or whatever, then it doesn't do any good. So we might as well make sure that I'm communicating that well. The second, I don't want you thinking necessarily as, you know, like people in the choir. I don't want this to be just, oh yeah, this sounds great. You know, I'm not looking for applause lines or things that you blindly accept. Yeah, I've heard that in church. That sounds good. I want you to listen to these kind of things and think, does this make sense? Or does this sound a little ridiculous? Are you making a leap? Because when you're talking to a skeptic, they're not going to say, good point, fantastic. No one's going to do that. So this is a better place to look for holes, look for objections, arguments you can make. Well, what would somebody say to this claim? So look for holes, try and tear it apart. Better to do it here where we can try and figure out if there's an answer and what that answer would be. And at the end, what is the most likely hypothesis based on these 12 arguments. So if you do come up with something, make a note of it. Feel free to bring up questions about points that we're making as we go. If it's an objection, a possible objection, make a note of it. And when we get done, we'll go through those objections that anyone has. And it doesn't mean that I'm thinking you have the objection necessarily. If you've heard it from someone else or could imagine someone raising it. First claim. And like I said, these are facts agreed upon by the vast majority of scholars. Jesus died by crucifixion. I'm not aware of anyone that disbelieves that. Any serious historian. There are people out there on the internet, blogging, making videos, whatever, saying that Jesus never existed. The fact is, no one believes that. In fact, Bart Ehrman, noted skeptic, former Christian turned atheist, very prominent, loud atheist. He speaks quite a bit, but he got so fed up with people making this claim that there was never a human named Jesus that his most recent book that he wrote is on the topic of Jesus' existence. Because without Jesus existing as a man, he's got nothing to knock down. He's trying to say he was just a guy, and he's trying to say that a lot of that we misread the Gospels, that a lot of it's fabricated, whatever. But the fact is, even the atheists, even people who are you know, the thinkers, the movers, the debaters, whatever, that are actually engaged, not just the bomb throwers, but people who are actually engaged, even the ones that aren't on our side, no one disputes this. Jesus died by crucifixion. Second one, he was buried. This one, not just based on common sense, well, somebody's died, they bury him. There are objections. People will say, well, most likely Jesus died, he was thrown in a pit, you know, just a common grave, trash heap, thrown where all the people who were crucified were thrown. There are ways we know that not to be true. For one, we know the name of the guy who gave up his tomb to put Jesus in. Not only do we know this guy, he wasn't just some, you know, one of the apostles, one of the guys that was following Jesus around. He's one of the Jewish leaders of the Jewish religion. That's recorded in the Gospels, and that was something that would have been very easily checked out. And the first thing that was said when people said, well, what are we going to do? We don't have the body. What are we going to do with this, this fact in the Bible? They said, well, let's say that the disciples stole his body. Well, why would that be the first place you go if he wasn't buried? People had to know he was buried, that he was in the tomb at some point, or they wouldn't say that he was stolen. Jesus' death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope. When Jesus died, everybody scattered. They weren't emboldened, they didn't know what to do. The tomb was discovered to be empty a few days later. This one, I believe, if I remember correctly, is the least agreed to by scholars. However, even though it's the least agreed to, it's still agreed to by at least 75% of when I'm talking about scholars, this is Christian and secular. This is not just a Christian thing. But the vast majority believe that it was discovered to be empty a few days later. Number 5, the disciples had experiences which they believed to be literal appearances of the risen Jesus. Number 6, the disciples were transformed from doubters who were afraid to identify themselves with Jesus to bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection. So these are guys that were hiding and said that they weren't associated with the guy, they didn't want anything to do with it. And then something happened. They claimed to see him. And then after that, they turned into bold proclaimers. Why? We don't see this happen anywhere. That people switch like that. Something happens to change somebody's, not only change their position, but also change their actions drastically to where they now are going out and evangelizing the world. They're going to other countries, other lands, talking to people in order to advance the gospel. Number 7, the resurrection was a central teaching of the early church. From the very earliest teachings we have, 1 Corinthians 15 is the earliest recorded we have. It says that we believe in Jesus who died, was buried, and rose, was seen by Peter, Mary, the disciples, and 500, I believe, is what it says in 1 Corinthians 15. That's dated. Most people agree that that's dated at latest within 2 or 3 years after the resurrection. Or after his death, if you're not going to sit in, if we're not going to posit the resurrection right off. We know he died. So within 2 to 3 years after that, the church was teaching the resurrection, not only teaching it as a novelty or, this is kind of neat or whatever. This is a big deal. This is what we are centering our teaching on, is the fact that Jesus rose bodily.
Was that an early creed?
1 Corinthians 15, most people do believe that was a creed. The way that it reads is not Pauline. It doesn't read the way he writes. And the meter of it, the words that are used, all that kind of stuff, it looks very much like how the Jews recorded creeds. Something that was easily memorable. Yeah, that's most people agree that was a creed of the early church. Oh, what's significant about the fact that it was just a few years after the resurrection event, if this happened, if this were, the church sprung up, 50, 100 years later, or something like that, and they start saying crazy things, making these statements that, seem outrageous, that Jesus that we followed, he was gone, but, he rose again. People didn't see him, but he did. We saw him, and he just kind of had laid low for a while. If that happened, that would be very easy to write off as myth. If they didn't have these stories surface until years later, but it didn't. This was just right after, 2 to 3 years later. It's not that long after. If what they were teaching wasn't true, people would have said something. They preached it in Jerusalem shortly after he was buried. I think 40 or 50 days after the resurrection.
In Acts 2, Peter preached it, and that would have been 50 days.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's the first time.
Yes, 50 days.
It's in Jerusalem, right around the corner. This is where it happened. This is the same place where people would have been that would have seen it, that would have heard about it. If he were in the grave still, and Peter's talking, people would have laughed at him and said, "Come here." And they walk over to the grave, there he is. But they didn't. So it's not like these claims just rose somewhere in Africa or something. This started in Jerusalem, where it all happened, where it could have very easily been disproved. Due to the preaching of this message, the church was birthed and grew. I think this is a significant one that we don't think of that much. Look at the size of the church today. How many movements can you think of that are as big as Christianity that have persisted for 2,000 years despite all kinds of oppression, claims to the contrary? If it were all just fabricated, how did it grow so fast? Especially in the early years, it just took off like crazy. And not only did it take off, this took off primarily amongst a group of people who were Jewish initially. There were a lot of things that Jesus did that the Jews weren't happy about. He did things on the Sabbath. He was hung on a tree. He made claims to be the Messiah, and based on all the beliefs of what the Messiah would do, he didn't do those things the way they were understood at that time. So for a Jew to switch allegiance and become a Christian, that was a big deal then. So how do we explain this? How do we explain them changing teams to something that is such a drastic change? 10, Sunday became the primary day of worship, and this is tied to that. Big deal to observe the Sabbath. And wholesale, the Christians, many still observe the Sabbath. However, they also met on Sunday in remembrance of what we do on Easter now, but we also do on Sunday, we meet on Sundays the same way they did, to commemorate the day that Jesus rose. So why did that happen? Why did, across the board, they switch to Sunday? Number 11, James, who had been a skeptic, was converted to the faith when he also believed he had seen a resurrected Jesus. For any of you who have siblings, growing up with them, then once they hit early 30s, they start saying they're God. I don't know what you'd do with that, but I think James did what probably most people would do. Whatever, you always were mom's favorite. She talked about dreams and angels and stuff. What would it take for you to convince a sibling that you were God? That's a pretty tall order. Yet he did. Not only was he a skeptic to begin with, but he ended up leading the church in Jerusalem. Lastly, number 12, Paul, who was also skeptical and a persecutor of early Christians, he was converted by an appearance of the resurrected Jesus. Why would a guy who's out for blood, killing all these people, trying to seek them out, learning their practices so he can track them down? He's mocking them, he's dragging them off, but then one day he switches. Why? I mean, that's a pretty big deal to come up with. What would explain that? So each of these, they aren't necessarily by themselves. I mean, they're tough things to explain by themselves, but some of them could be explained somehow. But when you take all 12 of these, and we're building a cumulative case, if you say, I found bloody footprints at this crime scene, okay, and then and we think so and so did it, okay. Oh well, he happens to own a pair of shoes that makes those footprints. Okay, that's interesting. We're not going to put him away for that, but it's interesting he has those. Okay, there's blood on the bottom of his shoes, and we found it in his closet. That's not looking good. Okay, we found a witness at the crime scene. They didn't see him. They can't give a positive ID, but he wore a pink hoodie. If you find out the guy's got a pink hoodie, and he ran to a Fiat, you know, not a lot of those around. You build up, not any of these are necessarily a slam dunk, but the more of these you stack up, the more things you go, what am I going to do with this? Whenever we have a historical claim, we look at 4 different issues. One is called explanatory power. When we have a hypothesis, and in this instance the hypothesis is God raised Jesus from the dead, a supernatural event. When we have a hypothesis about anything, does our hypothesis explain the evidence well? Does it provide a strong explanation? Or is it weak? You know, if it were, for example, with the crime example I gave before, if you said, well, this guy has tennis shoes, okay, well, that's not a terribly strong argument. The more specific it is, the more persuasive it is, the stronger the argument. That's called explanatory power. Explanatory scope means, it's talking about, does this hypothesis explain all the evidence? Okay, so you say the body was taken away by the disciples and hidden. Okay, but that may explain the fact that the tomb was empty. But that doesn't explain why James changed. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't explain why he went from Jew to Christian. Explanatory scope means, does it cover as much of the evidence as possible? And maybe not any hypothesis will cover all the evidence, and maybe some hypothesis won't be the strongest on each point, but what we're looking at is, you know, if you come up with a ranking system for each of these 4 items, whichever one rises to the top across the board is, almost always you're going to have one that stands up. And I'm not just talking about resurrection claims. I'm talking about anything in history. So you got explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility. Does it pass the smell test? Is it possible that the USS Enterprise beamed Jesus up? Okay, I guess it's possible. But it's probably not plausible. I don't think that happened. Does it pass the smell test? Is it, we're not just talking about possibilities. Do we have any reason to believe this is the case? So that's plausibility. And then the last one is called ad hocness, which I don't think is a word. Something that's ad hoc is made up on the spot. You have an ad hoc committee, you just throw together some people to go do something. An ad hoc explanation would be to just throw something together. In arguments like this, ad hoc would be, you have a claim that the tomb was found empty, and then somebody just throws something out there. Well, it's possible that aliens took it. Okay, but for me to accept that, now I have to believe that such a thing exists as aliens. So something that's ad hoc means it requires us to accept more information. So rather than dealing with the 12 facts we've got here, something that is not, or something that's ad hoc will require me to bring in more information and assume that as well. Does that make sense? So the hypothesis that is least ad hoc is one that requires us to accept fewer new ideas. That we can look at, here's the hypothesis, does it fit all 12 of these things without saying, well, you could say, or maybe this happened, or, you know, things have to be just so. So that's the thing we want to look at when we're talking about other hypotheses of what could have happened. Look at which one fits better. Maybe none of them is 100% on all of them. But of those 4 things, when you're looking at any given hypothesis, which one does the best job of covering those? So, of those 12 that I went through, has anybody either thought of something or heard something that is a popular or possible opposition, detraction to any of those? Yeah.
When you look at several of these, it at least at first blush looks like the evidence that you're looking for is only found in the canon of Scripture to begin with. So where is other evidence of, for example, the disciples or the account of James and his conversion, or some of these other places in extra biblical references?
Some of them, that's true, that they probably are going to be found exclusively in the Gospels, or in the Bible anyway, in the New Testament. That's not true of all of them. There are a number of secular sources for a number of the facts. Certainly Jesus' existence, the fact that early Christians, very, very early on, worshipped a man that they believed was God and was raised from the dead. Probably 12 or 15 Jewish, Roman, and possibly other historians that recorded that. I guess what I would say, my response to that, first response would be, why not trust the Gospels? Now, I'm not necessarily arguing for that these were handed to us by God at this point. Although I believe that these are inspired by God, I don't think you have to, that has to be a given to use them. People use the Gospel, use the Bible, the whole Bible for history every day. When people are doing archaeology in the whole Middle East, they carry a map and an Old Testament with them everywhere they go, and because of how reliable it is for information. So I would ask, why just right out of the gate are you going to throw out the records, the historical documents, which I mean, they are eyewitness accounts, just because they're in the Bible? Does that make sense? And I would say too, somebody would say, well, they're Christians. Okay, if you saw something persuasive, if I saw an accident, if I were a witness to an accident, and then in court they said, well, we can't listen to this guy because he believes that it happened. Well, yeah, I do, but I still saw it. You know, just saying that somebody changed teams or is on that team doesn't say that they can't do history.
That was also an important reason for all the time crunch. You talked about how rapidly things were talked about and discussed. If your audience is still alive when your claims are made, there's every possibility for the authors of the day to refute it.
Absolutely.
And they do just the opposite.
Absolutely, yeah.
If this PowerPoint would have worked,
It would have been amazing.
it would have been amazing. Right, you're just going to have to imagine being blown away by my technical expertise.
Yeah, that's imagining.
I would have shown you, there's probably 10 to 15 secular historians, or either Jewish or Greek or Roman, who agree on the big three with a slight variation, the three things you said at the end. They all agree Jesus lived. They all agree that Jesus was crucified. In fact, some of them take great delight in pointing that out. And they also all agree that his followers claim that he resurrected. The other sources will never say he resurrected, but it will say his followers claim that he did, and they worship him like a god. And there's one particular satirist, a Greek satirist, who just mocks them for all their crazy practices, and in the process of doing that, points out all those key things. The only difference is the one word in the third point, that the Gospels say they saw him. These secular sources say they believe that they saw him.
You know, there are other things too outside of just written history. There's a fairly well-known cave painting, mural, whatever, of a man's body on a cross with a donkey's head. And it says something like, look at Claudius the ass, something like that.
Worshipping his God.
Worshipping his God, yeah. What they're saying, I mean, it's very plain that somebody's crucified and they're mocking him. And there's Christian artifacts that it's clear what they're talking about. So why would they be mocking something if it was a later development, if no one claimed that it was true? Again, not proof that it's true, but it proves the early claims.
I can't remember who stated this point, but somebody I read had stated, okay, what if Jesus was resurrected? What if he did die in the tomb 3 days? Do we have to necessarily conclude that he's God off of that? Is it possible that it was just a miracle? We don't know why it happened, how it happened, but he wasn't necessarily beyond that one thing, anything special about him. And
Sure.
the religion spread it out over this crazy thing that happened.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't heard that. I suppose right off the bat you'd have to say, well, why should? I mean, it's kind of a weird case because
Right.
if he was resurrected and he claims to be God, and you're going to say God resurrected him, it seems an odd thing for God to do, to endorse this guy, one out of all of humanity, to endorse this one who happens to be just a special guy, one of God's favorites or something, who wasn't really God. I'm not sure how, I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis, but I'd have to look at explanatory scope, power, all this kind of thing. He claimed to be God. Could he have convinced James to start preaching that he was God if he wasn't. You know, if he was just had favor by God. But yeah, it's an interesting.
I think I would ask a different question too, and that is, what would someone have to do to prove they were God? Because it's pretty hard to top that. Resurrect yourself from the dead, is in essence what he's claiming. I think that's probably the first question I'd ask is, give me a topper. That seems like a pretty significant one.
And of course, that's what Paul said in Romans 1:4, that he is declared to be God by, it says, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead.
Yeah. So that would go to all these early followers believed these claims, the basic creed of Christianity, the early creeds. They believed that, so it convinced them.
Okay, I've got a crazy one for
Yeah.
you. So I have a lot of atheist friends, so I've heard a lot of interesting arguments about
Sure.
this. What would you say to claims that Christ actually survived the crucifixion and maybe was in a coma or wasn't actually dead when he was put in a tomb and
Right.
woke up? Or
Right. I'll give a few that I can think of, and you probably think of other things. One, crucifixion was brutal. There's a recorded, I don't have the names at the tip of my fingers, but there was a guy who recorded, it might have been, I think it was Josephus, that recorded that there was a time when a number of people were being crucified, and he found out that 3 of his friends were on this list. And by the time he found out, they're already hung. He goes and says, wait, these guys should not have been crucified, so they pull him down. And they're freaking out, they made this bad call. They pulled him down, gave them the best medical treatment, best Roman medical treatment, and I think only one of them ended up surviving, the other 2 still died. They didn't hang on the cross that long compared to what Jesus did. Romans were experts at death, and they created crucifixion to kill them good, make sure it was done right. I mean, they went out there and they'd break their legs. In Jesus' case, he got pierced with a spear. They went out to make sure that they're dead. So I would say at that time, if there was such a thing as a coroner that could declare death, those were the guys closest to it, because they had to prove that the execution or whatever the penalty had been carried out. That would be one thing. I have to say that they're very unlikely to say that after all of that, all these people being sure that he's dead, that he still made it. Another one I'd say is when the women showed up to embalm him. Dead bodies do particular things. You know, they lose their color. They become rigid. They bloat. All this kind of stuff. So as they're going there and doing all this, embalming and everything, I would think they'd notice if he winced or was warm. Things, they've embalmed how many people? I think they go, this guy seems different. If he had been alive, you don't pack somebody full of myrrh and and walk away from him. But then the other thing you have to say, whatever condition he's in, he somehow rolled away a stone, eluded the guards, and snuck through town and got to his disciples and persuaded them that he was the conquering king. I would think if he did all that after laying on a cold slab, for a while, not eating, on the verge of death, but then he comes to his senses, and then comes and, hey, I'm all better. I don't think they'd find that terribly persuasive. I think he would probably not be in very good shape, even if he did make it somehow. That sounds implausible.
You need medical help now. That kind of objection falls under a broad category of all kinds of different conspiracy theories. And by conspiracy theory, I mean they require not only the disciples, but their families, their close friends, everybody, to organize a cover-up. So yeah, for one, I agree. If it's just a swoon idea, and my understanding is that The Passion, if you saw the movie, was pretty close, but might not even have done justice to how brutal it would have been. So A, you don't survive. I mean, it's interesting. I think if you take any other historical character and say, they went through these things, I wonder if they survived. I think everybody else would go, no, you're just not going to survive that. So you've got that. You've got the idea of trying to show up and convince somebody I made it. I just keep having this vision of like zombie movies where someone staggers in and tries to convince people I'm actually alive. Nobody's buying it because they know what death looks like and know what life looks like. But whether it's the swoon theory or someone stealing the body, or like the substitutionary theory, which Muslims believe it wasn't Jesus, it was somebody else who looked like him and he took off. All of them require an incredible leap, an incredible assumption that all these people, hundreds and hundreds of people, who had nothing to gain by following Christ, and who were used to seeing false messiahs be killed all the time, they suddenly conspired. People who were not known to lie suddenly lied. They turned their back on their entire faith, which means their community, which means possibly family and friends. They reject an entire lifestyle. Most of them submit themselves to brutal persecution and death. One of them was sawed in half, one of them was crucified upside down. You have them radically transforming everything about their lives for what they would know to be a lie. So let's just say, for example, Jesus didn't die and he resuscitated. Why wouldn't their extended family, when they see these people who for some crazy reason have decided they're going to make Jesus the Messiah and follow him, even though he walked back into town, I would think they would take them to where Jesus was and like shake him good and go, do you not see he didn't die? Or I mean, if this is a swoon theory, because he would be laying there in serious need of medical help. Like, this is the guy really? Or, you know, the stolen body. You just don't hide conspiracies like that. Someone who cares about these disciples who are still following Jesus is at some point going to pull the body out, lay it in front of them and go, face reality, guys. You're going to die for something that's a lie. So there's probably 4 or 5 different ones you can put there that make an assumption about how people organize and conceal incredibly difficult conspiracies, and you just don't see a parallel to that happening.
That's how Chuck Colson got saved, really. Going through Watergate, he realized that even a smaller group of people than the disciples couldn't keep a secret.
Yeah.
So he was in prison for it.
Yeah.
And then, you know, a friend offered to take his sentence, and he connected those 2 things.
Yeah, let me add one other thing. When you read the Gospels, and the writers are telling the story in hindsight, and they're often referring back and saying things like, you know, Jesus said, destroy the temple, I'm going to build it in 3 days, and they kind of put this little add note, oh, by that he meant he was going to rise again. That's an addendum after the fact. That wasn't written before the fact. And I wonder if, I don't think from Scripture that it's clear the disciples got clearly what Jesus was saying. I'm going to die, I'm going to come back to life, and you'll see me. I don't think they were expecting it. They thought he was another failed Messiah. In hindsight, they're like, oh, he told us. Why didn't we get it? But it was unexpected.
Yeah, there was no expectation, or I mean, nobody would even thought in that day, especially Jewish worldview, wouldn't have considered a bodily resurrection. It wasn't. I mean, today we talk about it because we believe it happened. I mean, it's in the conversation. That when they heard somebody talk about resurrection, to them, in every case, that meant the general resurrection, what the Bible talks about as the resurrection of the dead for at the end of time, whatever, of all, not of, they didn't believe a person, but specifically Messiah. There was no belief that he himself would come back bodily. I'd say, too, on that, could he have just been hurt real bad and come back? The claim that was part of the early creeds wasn't Jesus was beat up really bad and came back 3 days. It was that he resurrected. So the claim is that he died and he was raised from the dead, and that's what they believed in. The people who changed their views and believed in him. That's what they believed in from the beginning. So to explain that away would be a pretty tall order, I think, and have it be something that they walk away and refer to it as a resurrection.
Haven't you said, or haven't I heard that there were, in order to accomplish terror, there were thousands of crucifixions?
Yeah, I don't know how, not horribly long before Jesus, there was one case of an uprising, and crucifixion was done. It was done for the worst of the worst criminals, but it was also done as a deterrent. They believed in that, if we do this, it'll make people think twice about following us. There was a time when they were, I forget the numbers, they were crucifying hundreds of people a day for weeks.
Right.
And they were running out of places to do it, so they were doing it up and down roads and very publicly all over the place.
So if that's the context, and suddenly a crucified person is claimed to be alive, you know, to quote Harrison Ford, my favorite theologian, silence is consent. In other words, if no one there at the time raised a credible defense, how could it be raised generations later?
Right. And if you can do it, why don't we hear about other people doing it? You know, wouldn't we have heard of a number of other people that escaped crucifixion? You know, I don't think it holds up to the smell test.
I don't know if I heard this or not too, but didn't I hear that like the Pharisees actually paid the Roman guards to tell people that the body had been stolen or whatever, but it didn't like to.
Yeah, what's the reference?
Yeah, the guards have to confess they lost the body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're basically bribed to say it was stolen.
So if that's the case,
Why?
they're conceding that there's a body missing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the problem they're having to cover up. So.
Were the soldiers that lost the body the ones that guarding it? Were they killed?
Were they bribed in
That's a good question. Were they what?
I mean, that would be
bribed and
evidence too.
Yeah, bribed to give it. Didn't work out so well. I don't know.
I mean, that would be evidence because, I mean, you have a missing body, they're admitting that it's still missing. So you think that they wouldn't be, the guards wouldn't be executed if the body turned up.
One of the tough things about that is, let's say they were executed for losing a body. Roman historians probably aren't going to record that because that's a pretty embarrassing fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jews stole a dead body from a Roman squadron.
Right.
That's like a signal for Jewish revolution. Dead people can be Roman soldiers.
There's a tablet that was found too in a village that says that explains the penalty for stealing bodies. This was in the 1st century. Penalty that Rome handed down for stealing bodies of commoners. Why on earth would they care? It wasn't, you know, if people break into Roman, you know, or the tombs of the rich or whatever. Why, shortly after the alleged resurrection, why did they make a law that nobody can go and steal bodies from common graves?
I just read that. It had been against the law, but it was only a small fine.
Oh,
But
then
that law made it a capital crime.
Yeah.
Oh,
Punished by death.
Why?
Yeah, why?
Yeah, you should have just let it go.
Thank you.